Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sergio Estrada Villegas. I want to apologize. There was a mishap in my calendar, and I was expecting to give this talk at 4 p.m. Bogota time, but in fact, it was 3 p.m. Bogota time, and I was all happy and ready practicing. And so Angela and Trisha asked me to record this for you so you can have it right now. And I want to apologize if you waited a while for my arrival. And yeah, time zones can be a pain sometimes. So I'm really happy to share with you some of the key ideas and results from two recent papers that my colleagues and I published regarding the importance of animal seed dispersal in tropical forest, regeneration and restoration. So as most of you know, species interactions are crucial for the maintenance of tropical forest biodiversity. So community dynamics and ecosystem functioning in these lush habitats like the one I'm showing you in this picture all depend on species interactions. And most of the studies that have assessed the role and impact of species interactions in the tropics have been conducted in mature old-growth forests. And while the information from these studies is at the core of our understandings of how tropical forests work, I think this information is partially incomplete. Why? Because nowadays, according to FAO, more than 50% of tropical forests worldwide are made up of secondary regenerating forests. So in relation to old-growth forests, we know very little about how species interactions change during forest recovery and how they modulate forest regeneration after farmland abandonment. And this paucity of knowledge is problematic for three main reasons. First, we're losing old-growth tropical forests faster than ever before, therefore regaining huge areas of young forests all across the global south. So, and we don't know exactly how these interactions are actually changing across the landscape and through time as these forests continue to grow. And second, we expect that these regenerating forests will end up harboring a significant portion of biodiversity, including animals and plants and fungi and all other taxa. And so if these areas are going to be the reservoirs of this biodiversity, then we really need to know how are these species interactions shaping and occurring in these anthropogenically modified landscapes. And third, we hope that tropical regenerating forests will sequester large quantities of atmospheric carbon dioxide and will help us mitigate climate change very fast. And so I would argue that understanding species interactions in the tropics is really important right now and is in great need. And as you were probably expecting this punchline, one of the most important interactions in tropical forests is seed dispersal by animals. Between 65% and 95% of plant species depend on animals for seed dispersal in tropical forests. Moreover, some of the most specious guilds of animals in the tropics consume fruits regularly or exclusively, for example, primates, tanagers, and leaf-nosed bats. And so besides the academic realm, I would also argue that seed dispersal by animals is very important socially and politically. Why? Well, the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has put a strong emphasis on understanding the multiple drivers and benefits of successful ecosystem restoration. And it has highlighted the need to understand and conserve the flora and fauna that help restore ecological processes and biodiversity. So the United Nations is not only thinking, let's go and plant a bunch of trees. We need to understand how different elements of the restoration processes are involved. And so that's why they are deliberately thinking about the animals that contribute to restoration processes. So therefore, to understand the speed at which ecological interactions reestablish during restoration can be as important as the recovery of forest cover in degraded landscapes. So as I mentioned, ecological interactions are ultimately responsible for the maintenance of biodiversity, particularly in the tropics. So monitoring changes in species interactions over time can help practitioners evaluate the functioning and integrity of restoration projects. And despite the fact that the importance of seed dispersal by animals has been long recognized, we believe there are two knowledge gaps in our understanding of seed dispersal by animals and their role during forest regeneration and forest restoration. The first gap is that we lack an integrated understanding of how niche differentiation and seed dispersal drive tropical forest succession and how different aspects of seed dispersal initiate forest regeneration. So in other words, the gap is mostly conceptual because most of our toolbox has been geared towards plants, and we are excluding animals from these conceptual models and these theories. And the second gap is that we don't really know how fast seed dispersal by animals recovers during restoration, and what is the impact of different dispersers in forest regrowth. So I'm going to first talk about how we helped fill gap number one, and I'm going to walk you through a conceptual framework that we think is really useful, and it links niche differentiation among plants and seed dispersal by animals. So in this picture, it's a younger myself and some years ago with my dear friend and colleague, Daisy Dent, and her daughter, Freya, in a forest in Costa Rica. And some years later, Daisy and I were attending a meeting of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation in Indonesia. And we left, and there were two, a morning and an afternoon session on regeneration and restoration. And after leaving this whole day of talks, Daisy and I looked at each other and said, why is no one talking about animals? Why is no one talking about animal seed dispersal? As if the animals have no role and play in how tropical forests are regenerating. And so we said, we need to do something about this. And so as many ideas in science start after a simple conversation in a hallway and a cup of coffee, then we said, okay, we're going to help fill this gap by evaluating current theories of tropical forest regeneration and pinpoint their oversights with regards to seed dispersal by animals. And we decided to propose an updated framework or theory or conceptual framework that would include seed dispersal by animals without losing the key tenets of the current and useful parts of theories that would explain tropical forest regeneration. And so what we first found is that current theories of tropical forest regeneration and restoration are based on resource availability, and that plant functional traits and functional strategies are able to explain, or they claim to explain, the turnover of plant communities during restoration. So for example, in this image that I have right here is somewhat of a chronosequence from left, just newly abandoned farmland, and on the right, just older successional forest. And through time, we have a change in resources. For example, light decreases in the understory as forest age, and also water becomes more available in the understory as forest age. And I just used one trait that has been well established to correlate with the availability of these resources and how plants are able to survive and thrive as those resources are changing during forest regeneration. But there are other traits as well. I'm just showing wood density as one of them. And so just going from a pretty cartoon to try to put this in a more conceptual framework, the central themes of the most current theories are based on niche differentiation among plants, where the resource availability changes during succession, thus filtering which species are going to go from seedlings, and from seedlings to saplings, and from saplings to adults, and that such transitions will depend on different functional strategies. Moreover, we found that two trade-offs explain the establishment and survival of plants. One is the classic growth and survival trade-off, which has a long history in ecology. And the other is the stature recruitment trade-off, which has been recently described by Nadia Ruger and collaborators, which is a pretty much orthogonal trade-off. And that has a really high explanatory power together with the other trade-off to explain how plants are changing and the community is turning over time during restoration and succession. So basically, while some species are focused on resource acquisition early in succession and growing really quickly and being there for a brief period of time or a long period of time, other species are focused on resource conservation and they're just playing the long game. But then what happens in highly fragmented and degraded areas? These areas with impoverished seed banks and depopulated communities of seed dispersers and isolated seed sources. Like many tropical areas around the world right now, we don't think this niche differentiation only type of paradigm will explain how plants are changing and the community is changing through time. And so we concluded that the community reassembly may be thwarted because seeds are unable to reach sites and establish. And so therefore, dispersal limitation may be a stronger determinant of species composition than plant niche differentiation alone, particularly in tropical landscapes that lack forest cover and suitable dispersers. So then we propose this updated theory of succession and restoration where we retain the ideas of niche differentiation as the limitation for establishment, but also we added two crucial factors. One, we called it the seed source limitation, which is insufficient seeds are produced to saturate available recruitment sites. There's also a long history in ecology talking about dispersal limitation, but only in terms of establishment, right? There's a lot of seeds that are produced, but they're unable to germinate and establish. We actually think one step before that is like there are not enough sources altogether. There's insufficient seeds that would be able to establish even though sites are available. And under this limitation, seed sources depend on many different factors, including plant life history strategies, plant traits, abundance of pollinators, tree fecundity, and of course, the spatial distribution of trees in abandoned landscapes. The second factor is disperser limitation. We're talking about those vectors, those modes of dispersal. And this refers to the insufficiency of insufficient animals to move seeds into regeneration sites. And so therefore, disperser limitation deals with the diversity, composition, and behavior of dispersers. So if we don't have the animals in the landscape to move seeds from A to B, or the animal simply is not going to go through these areas that we want to get restored, then we're in trouble because we don't have the seed rain. And one of the best examples of dispersal limitation comes from those amazing observations in the island of Guam in the Pacific, where the invasive brown tree snake has diminished the community of frugivorous birds, and the regenerating forests are completely different from regenerating forests in nearby islands that do not have the brown tree snake. And so the integration of this seed source limitation and disperser limitation regulates the arrival of seeds at sites that need to be restored or sites that are undergoing regeneration. So these two aspects are occurring and they need to be understood before we actually invoke niche differentiation. So the establishment of seeds depend on animals choosing fruits, moving those seeds to regenerating sites or sites that need to be restored, the deposition of those seeds via seed rain, and then the establishment of the new community will depend on niche differentiation among plants and their different strategies and the trade-offs. And so we believe that this more encompassing framework and theory would help us actually integrate those researchers that are happy to talk 1 day or 2 days or many days about regeneration or restoration without thinking about the role of animals, but also all this group of researchers that do animal behavior and animal community ecology, animal movement, and kind of merge these two fields to help us understand the mechanisms that can help us explain how fast and tropical forests are recovering. I'm personally really excited because our framework has been recently considered as an important addition in our theoretical toolbox to understand forest regeneration. Lawrence Porter and collaborators in a recent review in Biological Reviews talked about the most important conceptual models that can explain forest succession, going from those classical models of Clemens in the early 1910s and 20s, going from the classic Collin and Slattery model of succession, and others going all the way up to more recent models dealing with socio-ecological systems. Our framework, based on source and dispersal limitation, highlights that the abundance, composition, and behavioral of animals are central to the regeneration and restoration of tropical forests. So to conclude this part of my talk, interactions between seed sources and dispersers determine seed movement through the landscape, therefore determining the speed at which forests regenerate and are able to be restored. That overcoming these limitations in the amount of seeds or in the amount of trees or in the amount of forest cover present in an area and the amount and diversity of the dispersers of the animal community will accelerate forest regeneration and will help us speed up restoration. And that the unification of niche differentiation and dispersal limitation, which will encompass both dispersal limitation and seed source limitation, can provide a mechanistic explanation of forest succession and restoration in tropical forests. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that Daisy and I have helped to fill this gap by bridging classic models of forest regeneration and restoration focused on plants and integrated key aspects of ecology of frugivorous animals and their role and their service as seed dispersers. So now let's turn to gap 2 and let's see how seed dispersal interactions actually recover during passive restoration. Gap 2 is substantiated by several lines of evidence, but I'm only going to highlight 2 right here in this talk. One of them is a review published in 2017 looking at restoration projects worldwide, and Paul Amelli and collaborators found that only 15% of studies quantified the recovery of animal abundance, and 22% evaluated the recovery of animal diversity within these restoration projects. In a more recent review of restoration projects from Latin America, Marina Mason and collaborators found that only 3% of studies use seed dispersal as a metric of restoration progress. So a very low number of studies have investigated the recovery of seed dispersal by animals during restoration. And so to help fill this gap, we decided to describe how seed dispersal interactions recover during passive restoration in a well-preserved landscape. And we use our case study and several examples from the literature. We propose that different parameters that quantify seed dispersal could be used as metrics of restoration success. And for this talk, I decided to examine whether local legal policies of restoration actually include ecological interactions, particularly seed dispersal by animals. And in our literature review, Daisy Dent and I looked at dozens of papers worldwide looking at which dispersers might be more important where during regeneration and restoration. And then we hypothesized that during the first decades of restoration, seed dispersal would be primarily done by bats, small birds, and by wind. Bats and small birds are less affected by the lack of habitat complexity, and wind-dispersed plants are usually abundant in abandoned farmland. As forests age and increase in complexity, larger mammals, both terrestrial and arboreal, and larger birds increase in abundance and dispersed more seeds and other species of plants. Of course, this is all contingent on the fact that there are still larger mammals, terrestrial and arboreal, and larger birds in the, let's say, in the larger landscape or regionally. So to test these predictions, we conducted a study in the Barro Colorado Nature Monument in central Panama, right by the Panama Canal. And in 1994, Julie Denslow and her collaborators established a group of plots on several areas of Barro Colorado Nature Monument. So by 1994, these plots have been abandoned for 20 years, 40 years, 70 years, and 100 years. And they also selected all growth sites that have not been used by humans more than 500 years. And so we have these 10 sites, and each site has 2 forest plots. And these plots have been censused 3 times, in 1994, in 2001, and in 2011. And I think there's going to be a new census coming up pretty soon. And so we have data on how these forests have aged for 17 years since they were first measured. And to look at how different dispersal modes change through passive restoration, we associate species identity of saplings and trees with one or several dispersal modes. And we have 5 dispersal modes. We have non-volant mammals, large birds greater than 300 grams, small birds smaller than 300 grams, bats, and species dispersed abiotically, mostly wind dispersed. And so to make the association between species identity and dispersal modes, we use a great data set assembled by Joe Wright and his collaborators using published data set and casual observations. And then I scoured the literature to complete the final data set for this study. And so with the type of analysis I'm going to show you, we're looking at the end result of dispersal, meaning the seeds that were moved by dispersers, germinated, established, and persisted. So let me show you the first results. Let's look at the abundance of trees for each dispersal mode compared to old growth forests for just one census. On the x-axis, we have forest age categories. OG stands for old growth forests. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion of individuals per dispersal mode. And so to ease the comparisons, I'm just first showing you the first 20 years of forest, the forests that are 20 years old, and old growth forest. And we see that the abundance of trees dispersed by non-volant mammals and large birds in the 20-year-old forest was significantly lowered compared to old growth forests. However, by 40 years after passive restoration, the number of trees dispersed by each mode was very similar compared to old growth forest. In other words, the restoration of seed dispersal interactions recovered quickly. And this result is quite striking because it suggests that we don't need to wait a century or so for dispersal interactions to recover. So after 40 years, tree abundance was very similar to old growth forests for most dispersal modes. So now let's look at the abundance of trees dispersed by each mode using data from our three censuses. So on the x-axis, we have forest age, but now it's a continuous variable, excluding old growth forest. And on the y-axis, we have, again, the proportion of individuals dispersed by each mode. And using generalized Linux mixed models, we found that, as expected, the importance of species dispersed by small birds decreased during forest regeneration, whereas the importance of large birds increased. However, and contrary to our expectations, the abundance of trees dispersed by non-volu mammals was significantly higher than other dispersal modes, even in early stages of forest restoration. So in other words, non-volu mammals are the most important dispersers in this system, and the importance recovers very quickly during restoration. And we believe that our results make an important contribution because very few studies have looked at how dispersal interactions change across all stages of forest regeneration, pretty much going from like very early stages around 20 years to all the way to 100 years. As far as we are aware, this is the first study assessing 5 different dispersal modes along such a long history of forest recovery. If you're interested in what happened with saplings, the results are very, very similar, and I invite you to go and check out the paper. But then one of the reasons that can explain the high number of trees dispersed by non-volu mammals is the high redundancy in the number of species dispersed by large birds, small birds, and non-volu mammals. So in this Venn diagram, I'm showing you the unique number of species dispersed by each mode and the number of species shared among modes. And as you can see, 70 species are both dispersed by large birds and by non-volu mammals, and 80 species are dispersed by non-volu mammals and small trees. And so for our study site, we think that the fast recovery of species interactions could be due partially on the high redundancy in animal seed dispersal. We also evaluated redundancy as a proportional number of dispersal modes per plant species. So for example, a value of 0.2 means that a particular plant species was dispersed by one of those 5 modes. And so for each plot and census, we then took the average across the proportions of all species and then calculated one single value. So in essence, we generated a dispersal redundancy index where higher values indicated greater redundancy. So on this figure, again, we have forest age on the y-axis, on the x-axis, and redundancy on the y-axis. And each dot, as I mentioned, is the proportional average of dispersal modes across all species at each plot and census. And we use our generalized linear mixed models with census as a random effect to predict the line of best fit, which is what I'm showing you right now. And we found that there is high redundancy of dispersal modes for all species throughout forest age. And this analysis complements really well our Venn diagram, because our Venn diagram, we have it for each of the censuses, but here we see that across forest age, redundancy remains quite high. I mean, in other words, the difference between the average redundancy across our chronosequence is only 0.018. And this result reinforces the idea that fast recovery of species interactions could be due, again, to the high redundancy in the seed dispersal. And this also makes a lot of sense too, right? From an evolutionary standpoint, a plant actually prefers to be dispersed by several modes or several dispersers, right? Imagine the extinction of the only species that is able to disperse your fruits, and that would be an evolutionary dead end. So this makes sense in evolutionary standpoint. And so to wrap up these results, I can conclude that dispersal interactions recover quickly during passive restoration, and that contrary to our predictions, we found that non-volar mammals contributed the most to the recovery of tree abundance during passive restoration. And we think there are three factors that can explain these assessments. First, I already mentioned the high redundancy in the number of seeds dispersed by non-volar mammals in other dispersal modes. Second, there's high landscape integrity across our sites. The Barrio Colorado Nature Monument has been surrounded by a very large tracts of forest for more than 100 years. And so there's high integrity, and they're all contiguous and connecting different areas of all the Panama Canal. And third, poaching was banned in the monument in 1979, and park rangers have controlled poaching effectively. Therefore, there's a rich and abundant community of non-volar mammals in the monument that can go from areas that were well preserved before farmers abandoned different sections of the monument. And I consider these results as the best case scenario, right, compared to sites undergoing passive restoration in the tropics. I would expect that the recovery of seed dispersal interactions will take longer in areas where human interventions have been more recent and more intense, and in areas where the non-volar mammal community have been diminished by hunting, then either other modes, most likely large birds, will take their place, and in some cases, these interactions will take much longer to recover, or they will never do. I'm really excited about these results because, again, as far as I'm aware, no study has looked at the whole community of dispersers across the first 100 years of restoration. So in light of the long history of studies assessing seed dispersal in the tropics, we decided to propose a list of parameters that researchers and practitioners could use to evaluate the speed of ecological recovery during tropical restoration. So for example, a low-tier parameter could be simply the total number of seeds in the seed rain arriving to a restored site compared to a reference site. Another can be the abundance of large frugivores, which can be used sort of as an indicator of restoration success, right? If you have, say, a troop of monkeys or toucans or other large frugivores actually using your restored site or going through your regeneration, site of regeneration, then this could be used as some sort of as a metric for restoration success. An intermediate tier would be the total number of seeds dispersed by different modes, or just frugivories targeted at particular plant species or particular animals. And by frugivories, I mean you just kind of sit down and look at a particular population of trees and look at which animals are coming and taking their fruits and seeds, or you follow actually the animals and either track them visually or by other means and see where actually they're taking the fruits and seeds. And so these metrics can actually start to differentiate which dispersers are more important than others compared again to your reference site. And they can provide fine-grained data on seed movement. A higher tier parameter would be an assessment of how different dispersal modes change during restoration by associating the tree community composition and data on fruit consumption by different frugivores, just like as that I presented here in this talk. And we believe that the highest tier parameter would be a network analysis that relate plant species with specific dispersers and then track network properties such as modularity or nestedness during different moments of regeneration. I completely acknowledge that some of these metrics require more labor and they can be more costly than classic biotic parameters for the evaluation of restoration success. However, monitoring seed dispersal during restoration will directly assess the recovery of the interactions that species require to maintain viable populations. And viable populations is exactly what that we want to, that is the overall ambition of conservation biology. And of course, this is also an ambition of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So I would argue, and we argue in the paper, that even though it can be pricey and labor intensive, we probably need to move into not only just measure how many saplings are alive or how many hectares were planted, but also how different species interactions are recovering in our restoration projects. And actually, in line of those thoughts, I decided that I wanted to look at how, for example, the Panamanian Program of Forest Restoration for 2021 and 2025, and determine whether animals and seed dispersal by animals or any interactions are actually included in the National Restoration Program of Panama. The main objective of the program, and I read as follows, is to increase forest cover, direct all actions that add reforestation efforts in the country, and prioritize the maintenance of seedlings, their monitoring and registration. As you can see, the program is heavily geared towards active restoration, and it makes very timid mention of other forms of restoration, such as passive regeneration. And I did not find a single reference of seed dispersal by animals or any other ecological interaction in the whole national program. And so their goal, this is a table of their goals, and their goals are only in the number of hectares restored and the numbers of seedlings planted to assess regeneration and active restoration, and across also agroforestry and logging. So again, the central activity will be planting trees with no mention of the recovery of the ecological interactions that these communities are going to need to continue into the future. So we understand that the program is geared towards augment the forest cover, increase water availability in riverine basins, and we think this is great. This is fun and great. But simply reestablishing forest cover might not be enough. And I think we should gain more if restoration programs coming from the governments are more holistic, and they could include other measures of success different than just number of hectares planted with seedlings. So to finalize my talk, I'm just going to highlight a few of the findings of our paper and this policy analysis. First, seed dispersal interactions seem to recover after 40 years of passive restoration. Non-woolly mammals were the most important dispersal modes, probably due to high connectivity and low hunting. I predict that this might not be the case for other tropical areas. Different parameters related to seed dispersal can be used to assess restoration success, and there are different tiers that you can kind of pick which one you prefer depending on your interest and in your budget. And that the Panamanian Program of Restoration does not include ecological interactions as metrics of recovery. I hope I've convinced you through my talk that animals are crucial for the recovery of tropical forests, and particularly during restoration practices, by both shifting our conceptual frameworks and including what animals do and what are the limitations that we have with regards to sources and dispersers in tropical degraded landscapes, and also showing this example of this kind of best case scenario of how passive restoration goes through, and the importance of different dispersal modes through time. I want to thank my collaborators. I want to thank Daisy Dent for all our great contributions so far. My co-authors for the paper that I showed you. And I want to thank people that help us read, my friend Luke Brown and Ana Cristina Palma. I want to thank also Liza Comita for hosting me in her lab during my postdoc, and the different field crews in BCI, and Joe Wright for assembling that amazing data set. I want to thank Yale School of the Environment for hosting me as a postdoc, and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute for also hosting me as a PhD student and as a postdoc, and my current affiliation, which is Universidad del Rosario in Bogota, Colombia. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me. Here's my email address. And again, I want to apologize for the mishap with the time zones, and thank you all for listening.